don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this episode, I'm joined by Rachel Curtis and Liz City, who are co-authors of a new book titled Leading Strategically, Achieving Ambitious Goals in Education. Our conversation here is framed with their 5 elements of strategic leadership, which are discern, cultivate relationships, understand context and history, harness power, and last, think big, act small, and learn fast. We discussed the importance of clarity of purpose and vision in leadership, the challenges of working in silos, and the critical role of coherent communication. We also explored the significance of understanding context and history, especially regarding initiative fatigue in schools, and how leaders can invite brutally honest truths to drive progress. Toward the end of our conversation, we delved into distinguishing between formal and informal authority and the value of iterative learning and embracing failure. Before we get into the conversation, I did want to share that we have a couple things on the very near horizon that we're excited about. We've been working for quite some time on developing an online course for differentiated instruction, and we'll be announcing details of that, which will be available on our website, wegrowteachers.com, of course. And I'm also excited about a partnership that we have just formed with a powerful new AI tool that will help teachers do one of the things they sometimes struggle with the most, and that is design meaningful, authentic learning experiences that build both academic knowledge and critical thinking skills. This AI tool will be a great co-pilot and thought partner in and outside of our regular professional development workshops, and will include our Thought Stretchers PBL model and knowledge-rich inquiry framework. So stay tuned for more details on that, as we hope to launch that very soon. If you are interested in our professional development, whether it's differentiated instruction, project-based learning, inquiry, or any of the other areas in which we work, please visit wegrowteachers.com. There you'll find all of our workshops and professional learning services, as well as lots of information, blogs, and this podcast. If you have questions or want to talk more about any of those things, please feel free to reach out to me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. And now here's my conversation with Rachel and Liz. I am with Rachel Curtis and Liz City, and we're going to talk about their book, Leading Strategically, Achieving Ambitious Goals in Education, and getting into the 5 elements of strategic leadership. But I want to give them an opportunity to introduce themselves, and then we'll talk about the big picture of the book and get into more details. But why don't we start with you, Rachel, and then we'll go to you, Liz.
Sounds great. It's great to be here. Thank you for having us. I'm Rachel Curtis, and my real start in all of this is that I spent 10 years in the Boston Public Schools supporting educators' professional development. So my work has always been focused on adult learning, and it's driven by my fundamental belief that the more the adults are learning, the better positioned we are to support student learning. And so I've done work in teacher inquiry. I've done a lot of work in leadership development, so teacher leadership development, and also principal preparation, and then have evolved that to also focus on superintendents. And I run a network of urban superintendents for the Aspen Institute. And in all of that work, we started to see some really interesting patterns that we'll talk about, I'm sure, during this conversation that led us to write the book. So super excited to be here.
Okay, so just to sort of follow up on some of those things. So you worked in Boston Public. I'm assuming, was there teaching before you started working with teachers?
Yeah, so
okay.
My journey's been an interesting one. I've taught in or done student support all the way around K-12, so pre-K, college, high school alternative settings, and then graduate school. I have not taught in a K-12 setting. So I've done everything all around it, but have not actually taught in a K-12 setting.
Okay. Yeah. And Liz?
It's a good place for me to jump in because I started off teaching as a middle school and high school teacher, English and social studies, sometimes combined for humanities. Loved teaching. 7th grade was my favorite. I was a teacher leader before we called them that. I just thought we need to learn some stuff. Let's figure out how to do it, mostly because our students were struggling to read in middle school and we had no idea what to do. And I later became a principal, and then I was a coach in the Boston Public Schools, which is actually where I met Rachel, because she was overseeing all the coaching in Boston at that time. And then I wanted to figure out, how do we create amazing learning in schools for a lot more kids than just the one where I am? And so I went back and got my doctorate, and that kind of started me on a pathway of trying to figure out, how do we improve learning at a larger scale. So my day job now is I teach at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I helped start our doctoral program in education leadership there. I ran that for a long time and worked with leaders all around the country.
I'm curious, from both of you too, what was your, I guess, pre-service experience? Where was that? What was that like? And maybe that's something we'll touch on here as we were talking before we hit record. As my oldest daughter is just starting her elementary education certification process, and it's interesting to see what she's learning and maybe what she's not learning. And I'm sure neither of you would be surprised to hear that teacher pre-service does not have the best reputation. So curious what your experience was, and so maybe Rachel, you can regale us with your story, and then hear from Liz.
Sure. Well, and in fact, because I didn't teach, I didn't go through a classic pre-service program. So my perspective on, I got a master's in educational leadership. And my perspective on this comes from a slightly different angle, which was being the person overseeing educator development in the Boston Public Schools and having real concerns about our teacher certification pathways. And so we started a conversation with all of the folks that were training the teachers we were hiring about what we need. And it was not aligned very well with what they were teaching. And so we did a lot of work to try to build that alignment. And we also built our own internal teacher education certification program. And it was one of the early residency models. It's called the Boston Teacher Residency. And it was an opportunity for folks to spend a year. They were getting their coursework to get certified in the degree, but they were also spending 4 days a week in our schools, learning how to do the work, and aligned to our curricula, just a bunch of things that were going to make them much more powerful educators much more quickly. And then we also decided that we wanted them to have the opportunity to get certified to teach multilingual learners, and also with a special education certification, because those were the places where we had the biggest needs. And some of those folks have that program started 20 plus years ago, and some of them have taken on powerful leadership roles as teachers and in other capacities, both within the Boston Public Schools and also in that Boston community more broadly. So
interesting. Liz?
So I didn't know that I wanted to be a teacher at first. And so I kind of fell into teaching after I graduated from college. I wanted to just do a service year, and I ended up in Russia. I had studied Russian. I grew up in the Cold War era. So I'd studied Russian in college. I went to Russia. I taught English in a Russian public school. And I was like, this is fun. I want to do more of this. But by the time I came back, I couldn't get a job. I also didn't have a teaching certificate because they didn't really have those at the college I went to. And so I worked in publishing, working on third grade textbooks in Spanish. And I was like, wow, this is a lot less fun than teaching. But I still didn't have my teaching certificate. So I taught in a private school in the Boston area, which was completely eye-opening because I had attended public schools in 4 different states myself, but I mostly lived in small, fairly rural places and hadn't ever even been inside a private school until I went to college. And so I was like, wait a second, this is what kind of education kids are getting access to? Hold on. And so that confirmed for me that I love teaching. And so I was like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. Now I need to go get my teaching certificate. So I went and got my master's in teaching at Brown. did my pre-service in service at the in Providence, Rhode Island, and then and then I just taught in North Carolina and other places. Anyway, so but it was I say that because I always have reflected that it was good for me that my first couple of years of teaching were lower stakes, I think, because like when I was teaching in Russia, like I was like the bonus English teacher, you know. I was like the fun American. I just made up all of my stuff, and I was just supposed to speak English, so that was easy. Try to teach them English. I was kind of figuring things out, and then when I taught in the private school, I mean, I was an English teacher of like English language arts, and we did like old school diagramming sentences and stuff as part of the curriculum, but the teachers who had been there a long time like handed me a bunch of stuff and were like, this is what you should do. You're teaching, you get to choose one book that you're working with the kids this year, but otherwise you're teaching these 4 books. And, so I didn't, all the things we know now about how you support new teachers, like it's not great for them to start everything from scratch, right? Like you need to give them a high quality curriculum and instructional materials. I sort of had like dumped that. I got that dumped in my lap. And a lot of the kids were pretty self-sufficient learners. So I hope I helped them learn things, but they weren't as dependent on me for their learning as kids I worked with later in my career. So it was like a good warm. And then I went and learned how to actually teach, So so I still consider myself first and foremost a teacher. Like that's my primary professional identity. I lead lots of things, but teaching is the thing that brings me the most joy in my work. So,
Okay. Well, maybe we'll get into some of the details there and the criticisms of teacher prep and that kind of thing. But let's get to the book. One of the questions that I hear people, I think, like to get when they're talking about their book is, what's the book about? So I'll ask you to kind of give us a rundown. What is the book about? And a sort of follow-up question that I mean, in no harsh or negative terms, but why do we need another book on school leadership? So what's the book about, and why do we need another book in school leadership?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think we didn't ask it as we were working on this, because you don't spend 2 years writing a book unless you think there's some value add. So Liz and I wrote a book together in 2009 called Strategy in Action. And that book was about how to build a strategy for school improvement. And that was built off of seeing lots of school improvement plans that weren't alive. They didn't drive what the schools did. Folks didn't feel connected to them. And we said, there's another way to do this. And so we wrote that book. And then we spent about 16 years working with lots of schools and school systems all over the country around this idea of strategy development. And what we saw was a set of patterns about what leaders, and that can be a teacher leader, that can be a principal, the behaviors, the way they thought, the way they led, their habits of mind. We started to see some similarities in those. And then we saw the sort of the inverse. We saw some patterns about what folks struggled with. And what we came to appreciate was that in addition to having a strategy, just like a classroom teacher who is thinking about what are her objectives, where does she want to be at the end of the year, backwards mapping from that to units and lessons, that the same is true in any of these environments. It is this sense that there are a set of things, a clarity of purpose, and a way to pursue work that could be wildly helpful for us to unpack. And so that was what drove us to articulate these sets of knowledge, skills, and habits of mind that we wanted to support folks to develop. And we wrote the book very intentionally with the frame that anyone who's an educator is a leader, has a potential to be a leader, is leading in some way. Any classroom teacher who is leading his or her classroom full of students in their learning is a leader. And so what we wrote is something that can be applicable across the board.
Okay. Liz, anything you want to add to that?
No, I guess just on the why one more book on leadership is just that what Rachel was saying about we see like really hardworking, good intentioned people not getting as far as they want to and also burning out. And we were like, okay, there are some different ways to act. And can we try to break all that complexity down into something that would actually be useful for people? So mostly we just wanted to help people. That's why we wrote the book.
So one of the things I think, at least later in the book, that you mentioned is sort of the tension between simplicity and complexity, and I think that's important. But I guess the framing of the book is through what you call the 5 elements of strategic leadership. So discern, cultivate relationships, understand context and history, harness power, and then the 5th one, think big, act small, and learn fast. So maybe if you can kind of give us the elevator pitch on a very long elevator ride, what's the genesis of these 5 elements, and why do you think they're, I guess, so important?
Well, the genesis is a long brainstorming. We spent really a year trying to figure out, of all the different things we think we know about effective leadership, and particularly these very intentional things that leaders do to be more effective, how can we boil that down in a way that's going to be accessible and not overwhelming? And so somewhere we have a picture of a massive amount of sticky notes on the wall in Rachel's kitchen, where we were brainstorming, what do we think all of the things are that go into this kind of leadership? And we thought we were doing pretty well, and we boiled it down to, I don't know, what was it, Rachel, like 7 or 9? And we're like, that's still too many. It's still too many. And so I, for example, was like, well, not discern. We're not going to do discern. I threw that one out really early on. And then about 6 months later, I was like, maybe we should bring discern back. So it was a very iterative process. And we kept just coming back to, what are the stuck places we see people stumbling over? What are the problems we're trying to help solve? And try to use that to winnow it down. Rachel, what else would you add to kind of here?
Well, I think in some ways, what I'd say add to that is that some of the stuck places were like the 1st and the 5th elements, discern and think big, act small, learn fast, were organized on the dilemma we consistently see folks with, which is sometimes there's a lack of clarity of purpose. There are too many purposes. There's no purpose. People are doing things without clarity about why they're doing things. People are addressing symptoms of problems, not root causes, and then the problem comes back 6 months later, and they're super frustrated, or they're sort of throwing spaghetti at the wall because they're trying to figure out how to solve a problem, but they don't know how to figure out how much spaghetti, or could we narrow it down to like the 3 things we think might work, and then how can we experiment with it? And so we sort of thought that, and then this idea of get to those 3 things and then take little steps, and then learn from those little steps and have that drive the flywheel of improvement. And so those are sort of these big ideas about sort of how you pursue work. And then the 3 elements in the middle, cultivating relationships, understanding context and history, and harnessing power, are really about, so how do you do that? Like, what are the things you really have to pay attention to as you try to do that work? And so, and some of our observations are just that because of the urgency and how fast things move in schools, and school systems, some very foundational things, like, do we recognize people's humanity and cultivate relationships? So that's both about, like, do I say good morning to you? Do I have lunch with you and talk about our lives, or our kids, or what I'm doing in my classroom? And then also, do the 3rd grade teachers talk to the 4th grade teachers, talk to the 5th grade teachers? Like, do we think about vertical alignment? Do we think about how the relationships of kids' experiences in school across years informs their learning. So that was sort of that one. Then context and history is about, well, what went on for the kid last year? What's going on in the school community right now? What do I need to be mindful about this class of kids that I have in front of me? What do I need to be mindful about as a principal in my first year versus my fifth year? So that was sort of thinking about context and history. And then the third one, harnessing power, was really our effort to talk about something that in our experience, people don't talk much about in education. And anyone who's been in a school where there's a teacher who runs a place informally, we've all been there. We've all seen teachers with enormous informal authority for a whole variety of reasons: their talents, their relationship building skills, their connections with kids. And so we really wanted to acknowledge that power is always in play. Anyone who's watched a teacher wrangle a bunch of third graders knows that power is always at play, right? And so we wanted to help folks think about, like, how do we leverage that in service of what we're trying to do? So that's sort of a little frame for how we got there.
Yeah, and so thinking a little bit more about the first one, which was discern, as I'm leafing through the book and noticing again some of the things that I noticed when I first read it. One of the things that you're outlining or referring to that I think is really important, and I'm curious how much you see this lacking or the dynamics of it, is you've got sort of vision and purpose, and I sometimes put those two things a little bit differently: mission and purpose, and having clarity on those things. And vision, in the way that I think about that, is what does it look like, sound like, feel like? What would the evidence be of us doing, meeting that mission and purpose? But it feels like those dynamics, mission, vision, purpose, very often get lost in the shuffle for leaders. And then you don't, I mean, if you're going to discern, you've got to have some sort of guiding North Star to discern, to use in that discernment process, right? So I guess maybe if you can talk about what you noticed in the work that you referred to over the years, and the patterns and those kinds of things, in terms of having clarity on that mission, vision, purpose, and those kinds of things.
Rachel, I like to defer to you for all discerning. Rachel is our slow down and discern guru. So can I kick that one to you?
Okay.
We're laughing because I'm like
Liz is the think big, act small, learn fast. That's her jam. So we make a perfect team. Oh, that's great. I think what our hypothesis is that the urgency in schools and in school systems and the pace of them makes it very hard to stop and think about, what am I trying to do? What matters most? There are lots of things that matter, and folks often spread themselves super thin trying to do the lots of things that matter. And our observation is that burns people out, and it also leaves them to be less effective, which contributes to burnout, and leaves kids less well prepared than we all want them to be. And so for us, it's really, we talk a lot about, you want to be solving problems and you want to be pursuing vision. And I think it's really common that folks are solving problems. It's sort of that urgent, important dilemma. So the urgency of, I've got a problem in front of me, I got to figure it out. So I'm going to go do this, and this. But it's sort of like driving down the highway looking in your rearview mirror, right? Like you're thinking about the problems of the past or the present, but the car is still going down the road. And so it's this question of, well, what's also the vision? Like, what do you want? What do you hope for this child? What do you hope for your school? Because that's inspiring, right? Like that's bigger than the immediacy of the moment. And that felt very important to us to capture, because I think it has a lot to do with people's sense of personal purpose in their work and their sense of satisfaction and how they show up at work.
Okay. Liz, I know you're not the discernment queen. Anything you want to add there?
I mean, I think we underestimate the value of the pause because of this urgency, because we have really good intentions. We try to just help everybody all the time, solve all the problems. I think it also kind of feeds our ego in a little bit of a way of like, I must matter because I'm very busy. I'm doing all these things. And just pausing to ask that question, why are we doing this? I remember when earlier in my career, I asked why all the time because I didn't really know. Like, why are we doing it this way? Why this? How does? And I feel like, I hope I still do that, but I think we don't ask why enough. And this discernment Rachel's talking about has two different kinds of why in it. There's like big purpose why, like, why bother? Why does it matter? And then there's also like root cause analysis why, like, well, why are we here? And you need both of those whys. You need to discern both of those in order to figure out what should we do now.
Yeah, it strikes me as I mean, discernment. I would categorize in sort of a critical thinking skill bucket, and I think that the importance of critical thinking in leadership or teaching, I don't think it can be overstated, but there's something there about having an analytical mind, and maybe it's related to something like stoicism, like that sort of pausing and being in the moment as opposed to getting swept up by the moment. And I would imagine my mom, I think we were talking before we hit record, my mom was a teacher and then a principal. She tried to get me at one point, or recommended or suggested I be a principal. I said, you're out of your mind. That seems like one of the worst jobs in the world to me, but all of that aside, I mean, principals or superintendents, I mean, just such a, as you mentioned, like a busy job. There's just so much coming at you, especially in bigger districts, probably more so. Maybe that's not true, but regardless, having the ability to sort of slow down and I guess maybe even discern what's prioritized, what's important, what's not important. And I think that has to be rooted in that vision and mission and purpose. So not a question there, but feel free to respond to it before we get into the second one, which is cultivating relationships.
I would just say that completely resonates. It completely resonates. And we filled the book with questions because we want to build inquiry skills. And because to answer a question, you often do have to slow down. And we really want to afford that opportunity to folks because the environments they work in, just by their nature, don't naturally afford that. And we think that's kind of the key to success.
Well, the second piece then, cultivate relationships. One might think that this is solely just interpersonal kinds of relationships, but I in reading it, get the sense that you feel like it's more. And so one of the things that I underlined here, when people and organizations struggle to identify and nurture relationships among bodies of work, the challenge falls along a continuum. So what do you mean by nurturing relationships among bodies of work? Because that's not interpersonal, I don't think.
No, I mean, I think this is the way we talk about relationships that's most different than the way a lot of people talk about relationships. For sure, we mean the interpersonal part. That's very important. We have a human-centered endeavor, learning and teaching. But one of the places we find that lots of people and teams and organizations get stuck is that they're operating in silos. For sure, when you talk with people in bigger districts, they use the word silos, but even people in small districts, very small districts, will say, I don't know what that team is doing, or I don't know what that other school is doing, or even, the fourth grade doesn't know what the fifth grade is doing. Or my son's in sixth grade. He literally just came home from school last night and said, hey, the kids who had that math teacher didn't do their summer work, and we did because our teacher told us we needed to. And then he said, the two teachers don't always tell their students the same thing. So in the same grade, the kids are experiencing that sort of different expectations. So I think it's all of those are examples of the silos and not connecting things. And what we find is the classrooms, the schools, the systems that are making the most progress, they're making those connections. So if we're doing professional development on something, we're also figuring out all of the other pieces that are connected to it. Like, is it connected to technology? Is it connected to the schedule? Is it connected to, like, what all is that connected to? And who needs to be talking to each other to make sure that we see the benefit of the idea, instead of each little fiefdom tackling it with good intention in the best way they know how. And I think teachers often bear the brunt of this, right? They're like, wait, what? They have lots of things coming at them that don't make sense together. So that's what that piece is about.
Yeah.
And it's about coherence. It's about alignment and coherence. And so, and that then translates to Liz's last point. It translates to the student experience. And then when it's the system that is struggling with incoherence, it translates to the principal experience. So the principal ends up having to block and tackle everything coming from the central office to, if they're trying to create coherence, because they're like, wait a second, that's way too much. It's going to completely overwhelm my faculty. I got to say, wait a minute, based on where we are and what we think is most important, these are the three things I'm letting through. And then I'm gonna find my way around the rest of it. And that's just not a good way for people to spend their time, right? That's not the best use of people's time and energy.
Yeah, yeah. And so in that chapter, you've got sort of, I guess, a pull-out, or I don't know exactly what you call it, but it talks about relationship mapping. And I'm curious if you can maybe unpack that a little bit. I think as a former teacher and now somebody who provides professional development, and of course, then I work with teachers and leaders, because leaders are the ones having us come in. I see that incoherence pretty regularly, and I experienced this as a teacher. Right, you feel like professional development is being done to you, that there's all these moving parts and they're not necessarily connected. And we really try to help leaders sort of understand, like, how do you bring in the voices of the teachers and get them to be a part of the process? Because in my experience, I'm curious how you feel about this, but even the most cynical teacher, or at least most of the most cynical teachers, and I was one of them, if there's some professional development initiative that they might even disagree with or have concerns about, let's say, if they feel like they have either been a part of the conversation, or at least that there's some clarity around the leadership having thought, being thoughtful about it, and recognizing, the relationships, or the coherence or incoherence, or all of those kinds of things, then those most cynical teachers are more likely to say, well, I have concerns about this, but I'll try it. I'll be on board here because I feel like this is not something being done to us. It seems like there's a plan in place. It's not just sort of scattershot. And, some of those questions that Richard DeFore, the late Richard DeFore, talked about, 7 questions that, to guide PLC in the context of PLCs, but we apply it to any PD work. Those kinds of questions that teachers will generally have, giving the opportunity to, or I guess being transparent, and that you've actually considered those kinds of things. So long-winded way to kind of talk about the coherence, and then if you can unpack this relationship mapping idea.
Yeah, I think the connection that I think you've just made is the connection between discern, and particularly discerning purpose, and relationships. Because I think what you're describing is when teachers are asked to do something, they don't understand why.
Right.
The purpose has not been made clear, or the purpose is not compelling, or feel responsive to their lived experience. That's where things sort of fall apart. And so it's a lovely example of how these 5 elements interact with one another, that you often see several of them at play. And so in terms of relationship mapping, it's really about, and it can be done at any level in a school or school system. It's about the teacher who's thinking about a unit, and they're thinking, okay, so what resources do I have in human form? You know, is it this museum? Is it this community member? Is it, you know, who's going to have an opinion about the way I'm designing this endeavor in alignment with our standards and our curriculum? You know, so it's sort of unpacking sort of what are all the things I need to be thinking about. And you can do that. Like, I think there are curricular maps where you're doing that work, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a variation on that work. And then when you're leading, when you're a principal and you're thinking about, okay, I need to make this policy decision, and it's going to be a hot button issue. How do I engage with the variety of stakeholders about, you know, what do the kids think about this? What do the teachers think about this? What do the parents think about this? What do our after school partners think about it? Because it's an after school issue. You know, like, how do you think about who are all the folks at play and what they care about? And then start to see, oh, wait, there are common things they care about. How am I going to focus my decision making around those common things? How am I going to focus my communication? A big part of the relationship stuff that we wanted to talk about was about communication, because so much of relationship building happens through communication or lack thereof. So so those were some of the things we were trying to knit together.
Yeah. Liz, anything you want to
add? I guess I would just say, listening to both of you, that the role of communication is really important. So Drew, one thing you said was, you know, whether, you know, has the principal or some administrative person communicated, why are we doing this thing? And as Rachel was building on that, I was thinking a lot of it is that, you know, a lot of problems come down to leaders walking around with things in their heads and not relaying them to people. And I think you're right, Drew, that teachers will try something a lot of the time if they have this sense that, as you said, principals are being thoughtful about it. That's a lot of what being strategic is, right? Being thoughtful about something. Like, oh, you've actually thought about this and you are connecting it, and you're making explicit for me the relationship between this thing you're asking me to try and this other thing that we've done and this thing we want to accomplish, right? Or this problem I have. And so I think it's connecting the dots for people. That is another piece of relationships, and it's communicating that. And a lot of times leaders think they've communicated it because they may have said it one time in one way, but you just can't connect the dots too often. You can't make those relationships clear too often, because usually the people who are working really hard to do the stuff closest to the ground, they might not have heard it, or they might have heard it a different way. So I think the communication part of relationships is often underestimated too.
Yeah, and that, I think, is a good segue to the third piece, which is understand context and history, because especially if there's a sometimes there are, I guess, adversarial kinds of relationships between teachers and leadership, and some of that is due to context and history, sometimes lack of communication, a variety of issues. But before we get into that, I'm curious what you all have seen or how you think about different professional development, I guess, models or ways in which it manifests in schools. And I ask this because, you know, we do work around the country, around the world. But one of the things that I notice, and you two are in Boston, so maybe you see this regularly, but sort of on the East Coast, you know, sort of New York on up or something like that, the professional development, I was just in New Jersey last week, professional development tends to be, I guess, lots of, you know, sort of choice sessions, hour and a half kinds of sessions where teachers are going to this or that or the, you know, they aren't necessarily all sort of doing the same kinds of things, or some versions of that. But then in other parts of the country, or I guess maybe most of the country, it tends to be more full day kinds of experiences. You know, our project-based learning workshop tends to be 3 days, so 3 days continuous, and that rarely happens on the East Coast. So this is, you know, a little bit outside the realm of the book, but I'm curious how you think about the different constraints or parameters? We talk about curriculum, systems, and practices in addition to mission and vision. Like, what are the curriculum, systems, and practices that you have in place that are going to help you do this work well, or perhaps be friction points and be worth taking a look at? And those sort of systems of professional development can be really challenging sometimes. So I'm curious, any sort of reaction to the differences in the way that professional learning looks across the country in your experience?
Yeah, what I would say is what you described, this sort of 90-minute workshops, kind of conferencey sort of day.
Mm-hmm.
The way I hear that described in school systems that I work with, and I work with folks all over the country, obviously a fair bit on the East Coast, is often the vehicle for teachers to get to dip in and out of things that they're interested in, often learning from colleagues, and that's really powerful. So I tend to see it that way. Certainly what I think it is quite common. It just may not be the environment in which you've had the opportunity to work on the East Coast. And it's certainly what I think Liz and I are both really supportive of is doing deep work. And so that doesn't get done. And this is hard, right? The urgency thing. Like, we're not going to get there in a day.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so it's got to be what you do all year.
Yeah.
And the depth of your work is going to deepen over 3 years, right?
Yeah.
And that is a really hard sell for people.
Mm-hmm.
Initially, they're like, "You want me to do the same thing for 3 years? I've got that's literacy. I got math over here. It's and my needs here are just as great for my kids." So I think a lot of that is, how do we do this in ways that deepens people's expertise? And simultaneously, like, I'm in the middle of a conversation right now where folks have been, a set of systems have been working on the science of reading for 3 years. They're starting to make some beautiful gains, super excited about it. And folks are like, well, we got to go to text-based comprehension because you're only going to get so far with foundational skills. And they're like, yeah, but how do we not abandon foundational skills and have people think that now we're just interested in text-based comprehension? These two things are tightly knit together. So and it goes back a little bit to this communication thing of, like, how do we tell the story of the relationships between things, about how things build on a foundation? But just like at your house, when you see a crack in your foundation, you need to attend to it, because you can't count on the stuff you've built on to be steady if you aren't continually reinforcing your foundation. So that tends to be how I see it playing out.
Yeah. Well, those sort of 90-minute sessions, certainly not something that we generally advocate for, although, they certainly have a place and I think can be helpful. But sometimes we'll get, and it almost always comes from the East Coast, and it sort of makes me chuckle a little bit, is, I've got a 90-minute session. Can you do a 90-minute session on project-based learning and help our teacher? Like, the idea, of course, is that in 90 minutes, even a 3-day workshop is just the starting point, right? And so how do you, and I think this is related to the understanding context and history, because teachers are keenly aware of the initiative fatigue. Oh, shiny new thing. How long is this going to be around? What is this going to do? How long do I have to commit to it? And, we've been doing science of reading. Now it's this thing, and we're moving on from that, and that sort of dynamic. How do we, I guess this is a question that I think is fundamental to the work that we do, is how do we get leadership to understand and engage in that sustained work that gets the growth to be durable and actually be growth, as opposed to just that sort of constant churn, that kind of thing?
It's such a great question, Drew. I think that whenever teachers are skeptical of doing something new or professional development, I'm like, this is a very rational reaction based on a lot of context and history, right? Like, I would characterize it less as sort of where in the country you are, and more as, like, what is the context and history of that school and that school system around professional learning? Because the schools that are really making progress, like, they figure out how we're going to have sustained focus over time on something. And if we're having 90-minute sessions, it's embedded in much longer, deeper study of something, right? So I think part of the way we get there is we have this little tool in the Understand Context and History chapter called Brutally Honest Truths. And we made it up when we were doing lots of work with people around strategy, and people were saying the grandest things. They were like, oh, if we do this, then this amazing thing is going to happen. And you could sort of like just watch people in the room being like, yeah, but it's going to be like last time where we just get going and then you're going to make us do something else, right? Or we start to make progress and then you take all the supports away or whatever. But nobody was saying out loud what the things were that they knew to be true of like the ways we operate that are going to get in our way. So we made up this little tool called Brutally Honest Truths, where you say if, and it's that ambitious, something you want to try, like to Rachel's example, if we focus on text-based comprehension and people are like, and then, but we don't figure out how to continue to build foundational skills, right? Or you could do it the other way around. Mm-hmm. If we keep focusing on foundational skills, but we never get to text-based comprehension, either way, then we get kids who, can decode, but not really understand, or who don't have the fluency to understand. So you say what the aspirational thing you want to try is, or you're already trying. Then the but is this little twist of like, but what do we actually know about ourselves, or we can predict based on the past? And then the then is the consequence of that way we usually do things. And so we found that giving people a way to name that can be very powerful and makes it more okay just to name, like, this is what we know about ourselves. This is what we know about how either we or in general people get stuck. And so let's not do that this time. What could we do differently? And so I think if leaders can invite that and even name some of their own and ways they get in their own way, then it makes it okay just to say, before we put a lot of time and effort into something, what can we already predict is going to be a problem? Or when we look at what's happening right now, what is getting in our way and how could we adjust?
Yeah. So that brings a question to my mind that, and maybe this is another segue to the fourth piece, which is harnessing power. Part of that conversation, or those conversations about, but those brutally honest truths, seems to be important to be considering research and evidence, because that's one of the ways in which we might predict what might happen here or might not happen. And it in my conversations with the sort of science of learning crowd and people of which I'm, a lot of it resonates with me and I think is important, they often are just really almost despondent about the lack of attention given to research and evidence by teachers and perhaps leaders and probably leaders, that there's just this sort of way in which people in education tend to focus on things, project-based learning being one of them. Oh, that sounds great. Let's try that. Let's do that. But maybe not looking at the research and evidence behind that or any given instructional approach or orientation. So how do you all think about the role of research and evidence and the ways in which leaders, I guess, could and should engage in it themselves, but then also with their teachers?
I think there are a couple of things. So one is like, like everybody's looking for a science of math, and there isn't one yet. But it's this idea that I think what's happened with the science of reading has been very powerful in terms of folks saying, oh, there's a body of knowledge. There are these things we know. How do we organize ourselves in service of these things that we know can be powerful and work, right? So I think that I think it's a much bigger question about the sector and sort of how we develop usable knowledge, how we apply it, sort of who do we expect to be the keeper of that knowledge in a school or school system, and then you go back to pre-service, right? So like, what does a principal learn about what they need to know about teaching and learning to be able to set their school up for success? What is a teacher's understanding. You think about a doctor and how much time they spend reading to stay up on the research in their area of expertise, right? I don't think that's the culture that we've created in the sector. And I think we do teachers a terrible disservice in that regard. But I also think that making knowledge usable and accessible, we're not great at that either. So I think there are just some sector dilemmas. Liz, I'm sure has a much deeper perspective on this as a professor who's trying to prepare, future leaders. So yeah.
Oh my gosh, I have so many thoughts on this, and I don't want to take us down too many rabbit holes, but I was just thinking, I'm teaching a class this week with my doctoral students in education leadership called Drawing on Knowledge to Drive Change. And so it's exactly what you were saying, Drew, which is we want leaders to know how to really tap into knowledge. And they've already had a class on how to be like wise consumers of evidence, but the class I'm doing with them is more about what counts as knowledge, like what knowledge are we drawing on? So we definitely need to be using research evidence, but research, both because of the translation pieces Rachel was talking about, and just because of the varieties of context, to go back to what we were saying before, even if you have the highest gold standard research, and one of the things I do at the Harvard Graduate School of Education is I run a literacy project called Reach Every Reader. And we have some amazing researchers running, gold standard randomized controlled trial research in early literacy. And one of the things we talk about all the time is, even if it works in one context, like then what when you try to do it in another context? And I think educators feel that on the ground. They look at the research and they're like, yeah, but what about my kids? What about our context? And so I think it's a really complex issue, because on the one hand, we all need to be a little more open to what about it made it work in that place? And then what are the essential things we have to know and do, right? But at the same time, we have to adapt to the context in front of us without losing the thing that made it effective, right? It's a really hard, complex thing. But then there's other kinds of knowledge too. A lot of the challenges we have are being addressed in all little pockets around the country, and not in a research way, but in a practice way. And then how do we harvest that as well? And also people have their own experiences, and how do we not let any one of those forms of knowledge be the determinant of what we're doing, but we're instead trying to bring all of those to bear. So with a critical, discerning eye. The other thing, to Rachel's point, when she was talking about how do we have a culture of really staying up with the research, I was thinking another thing I'm involved in is a project around using this amazing digital resource called the Black Teacher Archive. And it's a digital resource of teacher professional journals, magazines from like the 1930s through the 1960s is sort of the bulk of the archive. And it's an amazing, amazing archive. It's the way Black teachers had these strong professional organizations, and it's the way they communicated with each other within their states and then around the country about like what really good professional practice was. And I found an article in this archive last year that was basically, it had one of those little quizzes like you get in like, one of the magazines at the grocery store shelf, like, are you a this or are you a that? It was basically like, are you a professional? and it had this quiz, and like 3 of the 12 items were basically about like, are you keeping up with the research? Are you going to professional conferences? Are you keeping up with your professional practice? And I thought, oh my gosh. And it was from the 1950s. I was like, this is from the 1950s. And this was the standard that these teachers were holding themselves to. So I thought, I don't know. Do I pass that now? Do the people I work with pass that? So I think it has faded in the, attention economy of like things we pay attention to.
Yeah, well, I think that gets, as you're talking, I was thinking about the challenge of sort of keeping up on all this research. And, I have certainly more time than I would imagine most or any principal does. And I don't know all of the research. And I actually got a really thoughtful comment on something on a LinkedIn post that I had, and this professor, I think somewhere in South America, and I'm sorry for forgetting exactly his name, but he's an education professor in South America, and he made that point of sort of that the sort of science of learning or research and evidence sort of lives in a sort of theoretical world. And it certainly is, there's some of that evidence is drawn from classrooms, but not every classroom. And so how do we apply it, and how do we understand it in any given context? And then there's the sort of paradox of we certainly, like science of reading, for example, there's very strong research about the importance of phonics, and that seems to have been a really missing piece in lots of reading instruction. And so the evidence says we should really make sure that we're engaging students in phonics instruction in a way that will help build their foundational pieces, and then you can go into knowledge and all of those kinds of things. But some teachers, whether it's due to tribalism or the things, the sort of the context and history of like, this is the way we've done it and we've had some success or something like that. And so that might work for them, but that's not what I'm going to do, because it might not work for me. And people be pulling their hair out going, what about phonics? Like there's real clarity there. And something like learning styles, right? Which the science of learning folks, there's nothing in the world that triggers a science of learning person more than the idea of learning styles, and it makes me laugh a little bit. Sometimes I poke fun at them a little bit, and I've seen some compelling cases. Like, to my point is that I don't know how much of a big deal that's. Like, I don't see teachers trying to meet every learning style as though they might theoretically do. But I can understand, certainly, if it's a myth, and it seems to be, and Howard Gardner was on my podcast and he talked about it. My daughter, who is in education, elementary education, just sent me a slide deck of the work, and learning styles is a myth is part of that. And I was like, well, good for them. It's showing up in teacher pre-service and all those kinds of things. So the paradox and the quandary of how we devote time to the research and evidence, and which research and evidence, and then how we think about it in terms of will this work in our context? Because that's not as easy as it sounds. If you say, well, we're not going to use phonics because that doesn't work in our context, and I don't think that's probably a good approach. So, thoughts about that?
Oh my gosh! So with the keeping up, I will say, I teach at a university, and I don't keep up with all the research, right?
It's incredible.
So I think for me, the way I navigate that is like, one choice I've made sometimes is like, it's so overwhelming, I'm not even going to try. I'm not going to do anything, right? And it's like, okay, well, that's actually not serving the people I serve well. So it's like, I do a lot through sort of the newsletters that come into my inbox that synthesize a lot of things, and I just skim headlines, just what are the headlines, and which of those are like most salient for the things that I'm working on. And so that's one thing I'd recommend, is just find, whether it's your professional association, whether it's something more general about just the news and education, like find one thing where that they're going to summarize for you some of the key things, and just pay a little bit of attention, right? But the bigger challenge you named of how do you, like, what's that balance between, like, I don't think the phonics is really the thing for our kids, which is actually what happened for a decade, right?
And still happens to some extent.
Still happens, yeah, for sure. It's not like we're totally out of that. And I've got one of my kids who's certainly went to a school that did not think that phonics applied, and that has not served her well as a reader. I think this is where I think we have to have a certain amount of humility and curiosity, right? It's like, I need to pay attention to what is happening with the actual learners. Are kids learning? Like, if we had just looked at, are all the kids reading at the level we want, and then admitted to ourselves, like, no, actually, well, then what is it
Right.
that we could and should be doing differently.
Brutal,
And then,
honest truth, right?
yeah, there's this whole body of research out there, right? And same with math. Like nothing's been like packaged into the science of math in quite the same way, right? But there's a fairly robust, it's not quite as deep and long as reading research, but there's like a bunch of research about math too, you know, like so I think it's, to me, it's like, go back to the actual learners in front of you, the vision you have for them, that they and their families have for themselves, and like, how are we doing against that? And, you know, if kids aren't reading fluently, like every parent wants their kid to be able to read, you know, it's not controversial. And
Right.
so if they're not reading well, then something we're doing isn't working, right? So let's go figure out what that is and what could help us do that better.
Right, right. Well, let's unpack harness power. What are the main things that people that you wanted to, I guess, convey and communicate in this chapter?
Yeah, I think at its most basic, we wanted people to, first we wanted to make it discussable because it's always there, but we don't talk about it much. And we do ourselves a disservice when we don't talk about it much. Anyone who's been to a staff meeting in a school sees power at play, right? It's about who speaks up. It's about who's heard and who's not heard. It's about how much influence folks have. It's about how a conversation and how power moves around a room in a conversation. And so we really wanted to just build people's awareness as a starting point of like, power is always in play. And if we can build our skills of observing it and understanding what's going on, like why does that person say something and nobody notices? But if that person says the exact same thing, everybody notices, right? So sort of, can you start to interrogate what's going on and first notice it, then interrogate it to understand it? Because power is, it's often thought of as a bad word, right? It's like, it's nefarious. It's used for bad ends, but in fact, it's energy that is can be purposed in service of getting work done, getting powerful and important work for kids done. And so helping people think about it that way is that it's just part of the world we live in, the water we drink. And if we can figure out, like, how do you navigate it? How do you think about when you want to ally with someone? Because the third grade has an idea, the third grade teachers have an idea, but they're having trouble getting the principal's attention. And they think it would be really powerful for kids, and maybe they've done the research and they know it would be helpful. Okay, so the fourth grade is has some particular whether it's because of how they're doing with their kids or whatever, like they're listened to in a different way than the third grade teachers. Okay, how do we partner up together so that we can together make the case for why this is an important thing for us to do? So it's sort of, when do we ally? When do we give our power away? And that is ceding it because we don't need it in that moment. Someone else needs it more. And so how do you do that? You see that all the time when you see teachers working with kids around discipline issues. Like, when is that a power struggle? And when is the move that a teacher makes is, I can either stay in this tussle or I can step back or frame it differently or give the child a way to feel more empowered. So we're just trying to think about that at all the levels, like at the classroom level, but also at an organizational level, so that folks feel like they have more faculty with, like, and facility with how to use that as one of the tools in your toolkit when you're trying to get something done.
Yeah, when I think about that power dynamic, and I think you're right that probably far too often people think of it as necessarily a bad thing, but there's to use your term, discernment, that I think we need to think through, is the sort of, how do we discern between using your power and leading and leadership, and we talk a lot about inquiry and leading through inquiry. And so one of the things that I think can be really powerful, curious again to hear how you all think about this, is how can a leader use inquiry to lead the people that they're leading? And how do we get the voices in the room out and sort of democratize and flatten some of that sort of leadership structure, but also make sure that you are actually leading? Because if you're always giving voice to the people in the room, one, it can be too many voices. And I think you talk about too many cooks in the kitchen kind of thing in the book, but it also can lead you in down paths and roads that you don't necessarily want to as a leader. So part of that is, how do you frame the work with the right question? But therein lies a paradox and a little bit of a wrinkle, because I remember a principal who would come into staff meetings and say things like, the answers are in this room. And what he really meant was, I'm going to ask you to talk about something, and then once I hear what I want to hear, I'm going to say that's the answer. That's not the same thing as democratizing, and it, if you are clear about it and you can see, then you start to feel manipulated. But there is some sense of that. We do that with our students. We want to ask questions that are leading and thoughtful in ways that model and get them to think about things that we want them to think about. And I think that has to be true with leaders. So how do you think about that sort of, I guess, dichotomy or the complexity of that dynamic?
Well, as you're talking, I was thinking about two things. I was thinking about the container that we create, whether we're a classroom teacher and we're creating a container for kids in their learning, or we're a principal in a staff meeting, we're creating the container for teachers' engagement. And then I was thinking about purpose. And so I think that part of being a leader is being really clear about purpose and about the container. And so being clear from the get-go about decision making. Is this something we're all going to decide? Is this something I'm asking for your advice about because then I'm going to decide? Is this something I'm sharing some thinking with you and you're helping refine it? I think being clear about that has an enormous amount to do with then both the outcome, but also how people feel about the outcome. And given that the outcome often has implications for people's behavior, they're going to ask me to do something. It would be advantageous for all of us if I felt good about how we got here, right? So I feel like that's part of what's at play. And I think authenticity is really, really important, and transparency is really important. I may not like what you tell me, but you did me the service of telling me, right? You told me, these are the parameters, these are the boundaries, this is what we are going to consider, these are what we're not going to. If you already know that and you don't tell me that, you're eroding trust,
right?
And that is going to cost us down the road, right? So I think that that's an important part, and that what you're talking about is people have formal authority, just straight up. I have the job, I'm the principal.
Right.
That's a simple fact. It doesn't. I'm not the same as a teacher. I have different responsibilities. I'm held accountable in a different way, and just let's not pretend that's not true.
Right.
That seems crazy. Right. But within that context, how do I want to lead, and what do I want the power dynamic to be? So there's some of the things that feel important to me.
Yeah. Well, Liz, I'll ask you if you want to comment on that, but I know you, at least if I understand it, the fifth thing, think big, act small, learn fast, is your bailiwick. So feel free to add on what Rachel just talked about, but what's the big deal about that fifth sort of element?
Yeah, I have many things to say about power, but I think the piece that I'll add quickly is just that a lot of times differentiating between formal authority and what we call in the book informal authority, which is what are all the sources of my own power that don't come from a formal position, can be really important for getting important things done in the school. And it's people overestimate what formal authority can do a lot of the time and underestimate what informal authority can do. And so I think a lot of it is about, schools that are really doing amazing things. There are people exercising informal authority towards a shared vision all over the place, right? Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of it is about that. On the think big, act small, learn fast, that chapter really comes from us looking both at, the past 20 plus years of improvement work in schools, which we've been a part of, and, so many other people. And seeing like where do people get stuck? And any improvement process you see is pitched as a circle of some kind, right? Because this idea is like, we're going to try something and then it's magically going to become a circle where we try the next thing. But in practice, a lot of times people are just acting in straight lines. Like, we're going to try something, we're going to try something else, we're going to try something else. And it's this urgency of fixing things that drives that. And the think big, act small, learn fast idea is back to this purpose we've been talking about. The think big is, what's the big thing we're trying to accomplish? The act small is, okay, and how are we going to do that in a really manageable way with our current capacity towards that purpose? And then the learn fast is where we usually miss the boat entirely, which is ironic because we're a learning enterprise, but usually we act in straight lines. We do something, we do something, we do something, but we don't learn from the thing we tried and apply that learning to the next thing. And it's the learning and applying that learning that is what kind of bends that arrow back on itself in an improvement cycle. So, all the things we tried last year, what did we learn? And how is that feeding what we're trying this year? Or even better, what did we try in the first few weeks of school? And how is that learning feeding into what we're going to try in October, what we're going to try in November? And so that kind of reduces the risk in some ways, because it's like, okay, if we're in learning mode, if we fail, if it doesn't go the way we want, but we've acted small, it's not as high stakes that we failed. And maybe we can even embrace failure as one of the richest ways to learn. Yeah, I think we're really scared of failure. So we try to not screw up, but then we also don't necessarily admit that there's something we can learn. So that's what that was about.
Okay, well, I'm aware of our time, and I want people to understand that those 5 pieces are just one of the 2 parts, and I think if I'm doing the math right here, about the first half. So we have not covered the entire book, and if you're interested in the work, you should definitely go get it. I want to wrap us up and obviously give you an opportunity to share any links or anything like that, and any things that you want to talk about that we haven't talked about. One question I'm wondering about that relates to some of the things we've touched on is the sort of teacher preparation and maybe even leadership preparation, and what you have seen, maybe differences in programs, whether it's regionally or geographically, demographically, whatever. I asked this question because, again, my daughter's in a teacher prep program, and as we have acknowledged, teacher prep doesn't have exactly the best reputation, and I think in many ways deservedly so, but also I want to make sure, like, the claims that teacher prep is just not teaching this or not teaching that, I sometimes push back and say, so what's the evidence for that, right? Especially if you're a science of learning person who's always talking about evidence and evidence and evidence, and they say, well, they're not learning this, and so what's the evidence? I'm not sure that you're not making just a guess based on intuition and experience, and maybe you're right, maybe you're not right. But it strikes me as some of the dynamics that people complain about, whether it's teaching practice or, sort of woke practices or whatever it might be, is pretty dependent upon where students are being, or teachers are being, or leaders being prepared. And so I say you're much likely to get a different experience in a school in Kentucky versus one in Boston and or Seattle or something like that. And so I'm curious what you if you have sort of ideas, like if we could, I guess, improve, I don't say fix, but improve teacher prep and teacher pre-service and leadership pre-service or education, whatever that's supposed to be called. What would be on the wish list of things that they probably are not getting in your experience?
Well, I think to quote Liz City, who I often quote, centered on learning. Centered on kids and learning, I think, is because there just is an enormous amount of abstraction that can happen. Like we can have all sorts of ideas about what teachers need to know, and it's like, let's get super real about children in classrooms and what's happening for them. And so the more time a candidate for a teacher candidate or a principal in the school spends in that environment, and they are that plus carefully curated research, right? And thinking about the practices that span the space between the practice and the research, that to me feels like that's the crucial issue. And I think we tend to, it's sort of this idea of you got to hold multiple things at once, right? Like, so can we integrate those and build a body of knowledge so that the experience of a teacher prep candidate in Boston isn't wildly different than the experience of a teacher prep candidate in Louisville. That's a problem, right? That's just fundamentally a problem. So those are some of the things I think about.
Liz?
Well, embedded in what Rachel said is this idea you have to be practicing the thing, right? You learn to do the work by doing the work. And so, whether it's a teacher or a principal, you're embedded in the work trying to do it. And the other piece I would add is getting a lot of feedback, because feedback is what helps accelerate the curve. And teachers don't get very much feedback once they're full-time in the classroom. Principals almost never get any feedback except in sort of the ways people are responding to their leadership, right? But who is nurturing that new principal into the role with a lot of feedback? So those are the other pieces I would add.
Principals would get plenty of feedback if they just put listening devices in the teacher's lounge.
Well, and I always say, favorite data source in schools is ask the kids. Just ask the kids about how things are going, and they'll give you a ton of feedback if they think you're really listening.
Again, I want to make sure that if there are links and places you want them to visit, I'm sure there are. Now's the time. And then anything else that you want to mention or talk about that we haven't talked about?
Yeah, so I think the first thing I would just say is that the second half of the book, so that people know, there's no spoiler alert, is a set of case studies, and they span from teaching to senior leadership in systems, and they're just showing the elements in action and interaction because they all live together. So just to sort of say that, and then I think the other thing I would just point people towards is our website, which is leadingstrategically.org. And we're really excited because there are tools in the book, lots of tools and resources, but we're building new ones all the time. And so we're putting them up on the website as a way to sort of democratize access and to get people using these tools and hoping they'll be helpful and looking for feedback as people do that. So we're really trying to build a community of learners around these ideas. And are thrilled when they're getting the opportunity to hear what people are experiencing as they're starting to apply some of these ideas.
And they're free resources, and there's things in there like a self-assessment on how strategic are you as a leader and things like that. We're working on a Teams one right now. That should be up pretty soon. And yeah, you can buy the book if you want to. Or you can just get the free stuff. But if you want to buy the book, Bookshop, Amazon, the publisher, Harvard Ed Press, Barnes & Noble, all the places, you can find it.
All right. Any social media that you want to share?
We are not social media mavens, and so we said we would be wise to pick one. So we're trying to make our impression on LinkedIn. So that's the place to look for us.
Yeah, well, I've been engaging in LinkedIn more in the last 6 months and found, I think it's got some weirdness that people refer to, but every social media seems to have its weirdness. Well, Rachel, Liz, I appreciate the conversation in the book. The book, again, is Leading Strategically, Achieving Ambitious Goals in Education. And we'll put, links in the show notes and those kinds of things. But thanks for the conversation.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.